Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 25.6 top lane tier list. So if your content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. Most notably, we saw nerfs towards Karma and Garen. We saw buffs towards the likes of Smolder, Fiora, adjustments towards Gwen, Singed, Neferi, and I've adjusted some other things around. Let's get into it. To begin with, the D tier is going to stay with the same champions. The likes of Maokai, Smolder, and Udyr are all going to remain as D tier options. In the case of Udyr, this pick got nerfed towards the end of last season, has never really picked up since. Axiom Arcanist was something what people run on him. I believe it is still something people run on him, as it can enable him to have, obviously, those empowered ultimates being slightly stronger. Biggest problem with the champion, though, is he's just had a lot of power stripped away from him. He's no longer anywhere near as oppressive as he was early game before. Having that, nerf towards his RR really meant quite a bit. And, yeah, top lane Udyr really struggling since then. In the case of Slaughter, he got buffed, but you're still only really playing this champion in counter matchups. Specifically tanks. This pick tends to struggle into hyper mobility, large mobility, skirmisher bruisers. Doesn't usually have the damage to outfight Juggernauts and can oftentimes just be killed outright in Juggernaut lanes. He struggles a lot more into his matchups now, and yeah, outside of tank matchups, I wouldn't really recommend playing this champion. Spoiled the bot lane though, it seems to be in a pretty good spot with the buffs, so definitely recommend trying him out there. In case of Maokai, this is his third best role. You want to be playing him in either the support or the jungle. In the case of the support, it's his best solo queue role. In the case of jungle, it's his best competitive role. Really valuable amounts of CC on this champion. He just loses to too many things in the top lane at the moment. His itemization has been quite heavily nerfed and tends to differ slightly compared to his jungle itemization. Like Fimbulwinter, Unending Despair have been tagged, and yeah, he suffered from it. So Maokai sits within the D tier at the moment. Moving on to the C tier, then we lead off with Cassante, who tends to underperform in solo queue. If you put the games into him, you can definitely get results, and the higher up you go, the more valuable this champion becomes. But if you're looking for a high agency top laner, Cassante tends to not be it. The other champions traditionally have more scaling, and in longer games, you traditionally will value that more than a champion which obviously gets really good advantages early game, but doesn't have, or as a tank, doesn't usually have as much agency as some of the other options. Other C-tier picks include the likes of Jace and Rumble, other champions which are pretty heavily elite skewed. In the case of Rumble, he's just traditionally not a great solo queue champion, but a very good competitive champion. If you pair him alongside the likes of the Jarvans, the Vi's, which are very popular competitive picks, he can be really valuable. He, in fact, was the most valued top laner at First Stand, and yeah, you can see why. This pick in solo queue, though, and just in general for average play, isn't a great option. You can get early game advantages, but you traditionally just get outscaled by other options, and you really need to push your laning advantage to really get value out of this champion. In the case of Jace, he obviously gained a huge amount of popularity from Arcane. The rise of tank Jace obviously got nerfed down because it was overperforming. There are still aspects of bruiser Jaces which exist, and obviously full AD Jace is traditionally going to be the way you play him now. He's a hard champion to play though. If you're not comfortable playing Jace, then you shouldn't play him. If you're wanting to put games into him, he can be a very valuable champion to add to your arsenal. It's not a pick I would really recommend for average elo, which is what this is targeted towards. In the case of Silas, great counter pick option into specific matchups. He can be really valuable. You're not playing him outside of those matchups though, as as a blind option, he will really suffer. So make sure you're getting him in good spots. He is a flex pick, obviously, and yeah, can be quite a valuable top lane pick if you want to play him into your Malphites and other champions with very strong ultimates. Case of Yone, he is being changed in 25.7. They are removing the cleanse on his E and giving him, and also removing the crit modifier, which they did to Yasuo a couple of patches ago. I'm doing it to him as well. So Yone, definitely a champion worth watching. He struggles into a lot of matchups in the top lane and needs to get quite far ahead to really be valuable as a champion. But if you, once again, you pick him in the right matchups, he can be a valuable champion to have within your arsenal. Famous example is always going to be the Yone into Aatrox matchups, which Zeus played a lot of and really showcased it as being a really good matchup if you get the resources and are able to forge leads against the champion. Case of Swain, also a counter matchup. If you play him in the right spots into double tank compositions, he can be a really valuable option. Also, another flex pick, can be played in 4 different roles. Definitely value to this kind of pick. Gangplank, very hard champion to play, but can be really good in his current state. I think Gangplank is a very heavily slept on champion at the moment, and definitely worth like watching the likes of Solarbacker if you want to learn him. In fact, if you watch one of Solarbacker's videos recently, I'm in one of them, so definitely worth checking out. I'm pretty sure he played AP Gangplank mid, so it's obviously not going to be the traditional way of playing him, but it is always an option. Wouldn't recommend it, but you can obviously like have some level of diversity in build options, I guess. In the case of Tahm Kench, she's a champion I really don't recommend at the moment. I think this champ's in a really bad spot, doesn't scale very well with MMR. He's obviously very predicated on getting Heartsteel stacks, just people not understanding the champion, and most people understand how Tahm Kench functions ever since he saw a big spike in popularity and then got nerfed a couple of times ever since. He's really fell quite badly from it and definitely sits towards the lower end of the C tier at the moment. Just a pick I would not really recommend. Moving on to the B tier, then we lead off with Aurora. Aurora's top lane play rate has really heavily diminished. I wouldn't really recommend learning Aurora anymore. This champion's still decent, and I think the higher up you go, the more valuable this pick can be. It's really hard to dodge a lot of Aurora skill shots as certain champions if they have over a certain size of like unit hitbox. Her damage is incredibly high. She's a great, powerful ultimate. Just tends to be a bit harder to pilot, and if you're not looking for a particularly volatile AP mage, it's just not really worth picking it up at the moment. But if you're comfortable on it, then you will still continue to play it, and you should still continue to find relatively good results on the champion. Ambessa. Right, so this champion I've played a lot of recently. I've been really trying to learn Ambessa as I am playing in Manchester on this Saturday. I probably should have mentioned this at some point. I'm playing in the UKEL Grand Finals at the moment, so that is something I'm doing. Ambessa is a champion which I've obviously had to learn. It is a very core pick for competitive play at the moment. For solo queue, it's still a champion I'm not really going to recommend. She's quite hard to pilot. She's not going to be as consistent as some other options. I would say, generalistically, is one of the better blind options you can go to. There aren't very many counter matchups. A lot of the counter matchups in low elo are quite hard for the opposing side to play, like your Renekton's and your Camille's. Warwick is probably the champion you'd be most concerned about the lower down you go. I would say she's a good option if you're willing to put the time into her. If you're not willing to put the time into Ambessa, then you're probably not going to be playing this champion. But she's incredibly strong at the moment. There's no doubt about that. You just want to have the time and practice on the pick to really make her work. So if you put it in, definitely one of the better options to go to. In Elite, I'd say she's like an S tier option, so yeah, definitely watch that. In the case of Renekton, I really don't like Renekton in his current state. I think Renekton is a pretty bad champion. He needs to really quite aggressively forge early game advantages. He just doesn't scale that well compared to other options. He has alright agency for an AD bruiser in the top lane, but he just doesn't have as much damage as he's had in the past, and I think he kind of suffers from that at the moment. He's still a great champion at like level 6 to 13. I'd say that really is where Renekton shines as an option, but he's just not that great around that, and I'd say other picks can kind of outshine him, so I have him as a beta option, not a pick I'd really recommend playing at the moment. But if he was to get buffed, I could definitely see this champion like shooting back into the meta. I don't think he's too far out. I just wouldn't call him one of the better options to learn in this current state. Gragas is alright. I think if you're looking for an AP top laner with relatively good wave clear, decent scaling, good stalling, then Gragas can be a good option. He's a bit harder to play than some of the other picks in the top lane, but if you're willing to put the time in, he can definitely be a very valuable champion to add to your arsenal. Yasuo, I think, is incredibly hidden OP at the moment. I think most people don't really recognize just how strong Yasuo is as an option. Ever since they did that change to his to the crit modifier, it enables him to scale so much better. Because what you'd find is champions with some level of like penalty for itemizing in a certain way wouldn't scale as well because they get diminishing returns. They wouldn't get as much value out of an item as another champion would, because obviously they are penalized for it. Now that he's no longer penalized, his scales better. He's been buffed a couple of times. Itemization wise, he's doing decent. Like, you can opt into like your Krakens, you can opt into your Borks, and he's a really valuable option at the moment. He's not blindable, you don't want to blind him, but into some of those ranged picks in the top lane, he's an incredibly strong option to have in your arsenal, and I would really recommend learning Yasuo if you enjoy that kind of champion at the moment. Don't think he's one of the best top laners. In fact, I have him in the B tier at the moment. But if you put the time into him, he's like an S tier counter pick. Like, I really do think Yasuo is really slept on as an option. Another slept on pick, I think Sion's definitely one of the better blind options at the moment. If you want something a bit easier, you can kind of just sit back, wave clear. He's not going to have as much agency, but it's pretty hard to kill a Sion. And yeah, if you get ahead of the curve, he can still output a lot of damage. You can even opt into damage, like your Sterixes, your Titanic Hydras, can all be quite nice items on him. So I think he's a very solid B tier option. You put some time into him, you use him as like a blind pick, I think he can be a really valuable champion at the moment. Fiora, the buffs already didn't do a huge amount. I don't think the buffs were really warranted though. I think Fiora is already a really solid high elo pick. Fiora's never going to be a particularly great average play pick. Like, you're not really going to use her as a climb option to master unless you're obviously smurfing, and then you probably would. But you put the time into her, she's an incredibly valuable option to have within your arsenal. All 4 of the horsewomen of the top lane are incredibly powerful options. Your Aurelias, your Fioras, the other 2 which have like ran from my mind, Camille and Riven. I'd say 3 of them are really good for like general play. Riven is more of an OTP champion, although all 3 of them to an extent are like OTP champions. You want to put a lot of time and practice into them to really get quite good at them. And Fiora, yeah, I mean, she's still a solid option. You're still going to want to play her into matchups where you can get a lot of value out of her W and champions, which just can't really contest back against her, especially after certain item thresholds. Case of Vayne, great counter pick as a ranged option for top lane. Biggest problem with Vayne is she damages team compositions. I don't think the champion's that amazing at the moment. I think she is just a solid counter pick option in her current state. Nasus is alright. I mean, he's low elo skewed and he really does struggle the higher up you go. Nasus oftentimes has like the perception that he is a really, really good late game option, which to an extent he can be. If you stack well throughout the entire game, he can be incredibly powerful and do a lot of damage. But the level 6, 9 and 13 thresholds are really, really important for him. He spikes really hard on Sheen, spikes really hard on Trinity, spikes really hard when you get full access to your Q max. He does a lot of damage in like the mid game, and I think people kind of sleep on it and undervalue where the champion can be quite strong. If you play him well, I think this pick is better than perceived, but I also don't think he's that amazing at the moment. I think he does have some pretty hard matchups, and if you ever fall behind, you can feel quite out of the game for most of it. Kiss Rise, he's a solid AP option in the top lane. Traditionally want to play him into champions which can never really get onto him, and you can kind of always just outspace them. He scales relatively well, has good wave clear. You're not going to want to play him every game. He will have team compositions which you just don't really want to have a rise, and he struggles into range, but in the right spots he can be quite a valuable pick. Jax is decent as well. This pick obviously has a great time into auto attack based champions. He can struggle as like a blind option into certain picks, but in general, I think Jax is a pretty good pick, especially if you're very comfortable on him. He's not an easy to play champion, but if you put the time in, he can definitely be a valuable champion to your arsenal. Tryndamere. So Tryndamere is a weird one. He's incredibly frustrating to play, and his play pattern at the moment is incredibly degenerate, I would describe it as. But whether the pick's actually that good, I'm kind of like mixed on. The problem with Tryndamere is he is one very linear playstyle traditionally, and it is a case of just sustain from wave, siege onto turret, and continue doing that throughout the game. There are champions which will just deny him from doing that, making him kind of awkward to blind, especially when some of the easier options, like your Malphites for example, do it really well. I don't think I can recommend him above the B tier, but I think if you're comfortable in Tryndamere at the moment, he is a fine option. I think this champion is in dire need of being reworked. I think his kit is very counterintuitive, frustrating to play against, and I don't think he's amazing at the moment, which makes it even worse, because if you've got a good champion, or like a pretty mediocre champion, which is frustrating to like play against, then it tends to sign that he's pretty unhealthy for the game. There are people obviously who enjoy the play pattern, and that's fine. Like if you enjoy it, then you can continue to play it for the moment. I just think long term it probably has some issues which need to be addressed. Same goes for Alawi though. I think Alawi also has some pretty clear weaknesses, and her play pattern tends to also be pretty unhealthy. It is a case of if she can land E, this champion feels unplayable against. If she can never land E, this champion feels unplayable as. I think once again she has a lot of issues, and probably clarity as well when it comes to like how the tentacles work. I think sometimes it can be kind of misleading and the indicators don't always show the right direction, which I don't think this champion can really sustain its current health with she's not that popular, she's not that good, and honestly I could probably drop into the C tier and people would like understand, but she's frustrating to play against, so that's just the issue with the champion, and she's low elo skewed at the moment. In case of Trundle, he is also low elo skewed. He is just he's like Tryndamere, but I would say the play pattern is a little less degenerate. I think Trundle can kind of support the play pattern and be fine with it. I don't think Tryndamere can maintain the current play pattern without being very frustrating. Tryndamere's ban rate, I believe, is a lot higher than Trundle's at the moment. Trundle's obviously, very low elo skewed, doesn't have as much skill expression, but also tends to not be as frustrating to play against. In the case of Varus, he is another pretty solid counterpick ranged option in the top lane, good into a lot of the health stackers, and really hard to itemize against. Case of Vladimir, slept on champion. I think Vladimir is at a pretty good spot at the moment. We've obviously seen him come out as first stand for a bit. I could probably even bump him up to the A tier. I believe I already did in the mid lane tier list. And yeah, I'd say he is a very high B tier, at least probably even an A tier option at the moment. Carly, I think, is a pretty good top lane option. Not slept on. I think she is relatively fine as where she is at the moment. She has some pretty good matchups, like Gwen's surge of popularity is great for Akali. She tends to be pretty good in that matchup. She's going to likes of Olaf, not that Olaf really comes out as a blind pick, but she has some pretty solid matchups, and I think Akali, decent B tier option. Malphite, I don't think is amazing at the moment. You can only really bring him out as like a R5, B4, B5 counter pick, and even then, I think there are just better options than him at the moment. I think the problem with Malphite is he has to be OP to really feel valuable as an option. If he's balanced, then he tends to just be bad because the way of like just general tables and like pools go. Like you can have a blind Malphite. That's just one of the issues with the champion. Like whereas a lot of the other top laners, like he's one of the least blindable top laners in the game. It's the same reason why Rammus, for example, is a pretty bad jungler at the moment. He's just not blindable. There are so many, like you have to find the right kind of game for these picks to work. I think that is one of the prohibiting factors of Malphite. I think in the case of both of them, they're obviously easy to play champions, and that is one of their big strengths. You can just pick them up whenever you want and traditionally get the same level of results as someone who's put like 10, 100 games in on the champion. Case of Gnar, I might have slightly overrated Gnar. I had him in the A tier like for a while, and then I dropped him down to the high end of the B tier. Whether he's still a high B tier option is debatable. I really like the pick. I think he has some really good matchups and spots you can play him in. I wouldn't blind him. I think he just struggles into too many things. But as a counter pick, I think Gnar is a great option. He has some really good matchups like your Cassantes, even the likes of your Argots, shit like that. Gnar can be quite good as like a pick into those. Mundo, the Warmog's buff, I haven't really done too much looking into it, but it should be good for Mundo. Mundo is one of the champions which like I would say are right at the top for wanting to build this item. Whether it's enough, I still think this item is awkward, because if you end up with Heartsteel and Warmogs, then you have no resistances alongside it, and that feels really bad. Like there are lots of champions with just percentage health damage built into their kit, and that will cause you to struggle in some of those matchups. Whether it's a case of you can go like Heartsteel, the component for Unending Despair, why can't I remember its name? Aegis of the Legion into Warmogs, so you have some resistances as like a bridge into the item, and then you pick up Unending as a third. There are probably some ways you can go around it. I could probably bump him up to the A tier. I think both Vladimir and Mundo are very high B tier options, but yeah, I would imagine he definitely could be bumped up a tier. Here's for Shen. I'm going to drop him down a tier. I think Shen's really fallen off over time. He is being buffed in 25.7 in a way where it should really help him. Like, Shen's biggest weakness right now, I mean, two biggest weaknesses is he can't siege and he can't wave clear without, like, obviously certain itemization. And if you go those itemizations, you're naturally at a disadvantage because most of the itemization which you want to build for this wave clear are pretty bad. Hollow Radiance isn't a good item. Sunfires is also not a great item. Titanic, you have to take out a bank loan, and Shen, when you don't get a lot of CS, doesn't have that kind of money to throw around. There are issues with Shen's itemization at the moment, and the nerfs to Heartsteel has really hurted as an option on Shen. I believe it's still good into like tank matchups when you're playing Shen, but generalistically, you kind of just want to go resist. Like, Deadman's is the best tank item in the game at the moment. Most people have realized it at this point, and Shen obviously really likes it as an option. That's kind of the only thing really holding him up at the moment. In case of Karma, I'm going to drop her down to the C tier. Karma's nerfs this patch really hurt her, especially solo lane Karma. I think they went the wrong direction with the Karma nerfs, and they should have gone after some level of the E shield. But Q nerfs, yeah, the Karma solo lane, I wouldn't recommend playing anymore. I think the nerfs were really big for wave clear. Hearts are trading quite a bit, and that was two of the core strengths of Karma lane. I've dropped her down to the C tier. I just don't think she's that solid as an option anymore. Bumping up, I'm gonna move up Pantheon. I think Pantheon, I kind of got a hatred for Pantheon. I think this champion has really clear weaknesses, and if you ever fall behind on Pantheon, you are useless as a champion. You are just a point-and-click W bot, and hope that your team can do the damage for you, because he needs gold. He just has to be ahead of the curve to be valuable as a champion. I believe Pantheon jungle is just the best way to play him at the moment. Pantheon support is good, and Pantheon mid is I mean, I'd say both Pantheon mid and support can be really good in the right spots. I think Pantheon top is honestly maybe even his weakest of the 4 roles. That being said though, I think Pantheon as a champion is decent. I think he's fine at the moment. I think if you get the right matchups, he can be really powerful and like as an option. I just don't like the idea of if you ever fall behind or you blind pick this champion, he just really struggles. Yeah, it's really predicated on getting early advantages. Other options of the A tier include the likes of Kennen, another really slept on champion. He's obviously incredibly unpopular, but in the right spots, I think this pick is really good. He does a huge amount of damage. Don't fall for the trap of going Hex Tech Rocket Belt every game. Leandry's is an incredible powerful item on him. Also, First Strike is really nice in matchups where you can always get it first. This champion scales well, especially if you opt into things like Gathering Storm. Axiom Arcanist can be really nice on him. And yeah, I'd say Kennen's in a pretty solid spot at the moment. In case Poppy, she's a great counter pick option. The changes she received in the previous patch were really nice for top lane and really benefited her here. She's a lot weaker early, and that is noticeable if you ever play the champion. But her scaling's a lot better. And if you watched the Bouse player, I believe on yesterday, or when, yeah, it would have been yesterday for when this video goes live, which would be the 19th. You could just see the level of shielding this champion can provide. It's really powerful, and I do think she really deserves a spot in the A tier. Neferi, I'm actually going to put in the A tier for the moment. Okay, interesting thing with Neferi. So Neferi has had like a pretty unique kind of like come into the game. Her original kind of like appearance, she wasn't very popular, and she wasn't very popular up until she got reworked, and she's still, I don't believe, like insanely popular. But the thing with Neferi mid to top was Neferi top, I believe, almost always outperformed Neferi mid. Even like when she was weak, she would still have like she would still be better off as a top option. Obviously, there's a caveat that top lane Neferi was so unpopular that mostly just one tricks played her in the top lane. But it always looked like that she just could perform quite well there. So I think Neferi top might be a really slept on pick. Obviously, she got hotfix nerfed, so that is definitely something to watch out for. But Neferi top, yeah, give it a try. If you enjoy it, then yeah, it might be a really good pick within your arsenal. It's obviously not going to be very expected. If you don't enjoy it, it's not mandatory. You just should give it a go. I think it's always valuable to give champions which have either been buffed, reworked, changed in some manner of way a go. See if you enjoy them, and if you do, that can be really valuable to like enabling you to pick more champions, and it can help with your enjoyment of the game. Ornn could probably be dropped down to the beta as well. A lot of these tanks are really struggling. Their itemizations are in a really bad spot. The buff towards Warmogs was good because it was the weakest tank item in the game, but most tank items are in a pretty rough spot at the moment. That being said, Ornn is an incredibly valuable champion to have within your team. He has a lot of damage in his base kit, not so much through itemization. He's not a champion bound to the likes of Hearts still. Deadman's is a really good item on Ornn, and he can oftentimes go utility later on into his build. So Ornn, I'd still say, is a tier pick because you can kind of blind him, but in solo queue he does have a lot of hard matchups, and if you ever fall behind, you'll feel quite bad, and you'll oftentimes just end up being that utility bot, which can be fine in certain games. But I'd say he definitely sits towards the low end of the A tier, especially for a champion you're not going to get as much agency out of. Volibear over time seems to have not been performing as well. I believe nerfs towards his itemization, combined with an E nerf I believe he received towards the end of last split, has definitely hurt him a bit. I don't think he's bad by any means. I'd just say he sits as more like a low A2 option. He's an incredibly oppressive laner with really good wave clear. And is always the concern with the champion. He's also relatively simple to play, has a very clear game plan, and that can be a strength and a weakness of the pick. In the case of Zac, he's unpopular, but he's still a solid tank option in the top lane. Obviously, there was the whole Zac saga where they nerfed him like 3 times in a row because of just how popular, well, okay, not popular, but how good he was performing in the top lane. Broken Blade really and showed it as like being a good option. They've nerfed it a couple of times. They nerfed his like health scaling on his passive. They nerfed his level scaling a bit. And yeah, he's a bit weaker for it, but he's still a good top lane option, especially if you can pick up your blobs. You can, yeah, oftentimes do a lot of damage, be a solid tank option in the top lane, and yeah, have great engages like a option here. So I'd still say Zac is a solid A tier pick in the top lane. Wukong is fine into good AD matchups. You can be really into good matchups, which you can make use of your passive. He can be an incredibly valuable option. I don't think he is the best, and I wouldn't call him sleeper OP because the nerfs he received back along did hurt him in the top lane and have noticeably dropped him down a bit. But in the right spots, I still think Wukong is a very powerful champion. Alongside like the other niche picks of like your Heimerdingers and your Kleds, I think these 3 champions are unpopular, but can be really good if you're very comfortable on the champions. In the case of Camille and Rhythm and Aurelia, honestly, if you're very good at these picks, they are S tier and you will like perform really well on them. If you can't play the champions, then you will struggle. You need to put time into these picks, like 50 odd games to really get consistent at them. They will scale all the way up to like thousands of games. Like if you put that time in, then you will get the results which you deserve. If you don't and you play them on a very surface level, you will struggle and you oftentimes just find yourself feeding in games. So definitely put the time in. If you're not like wanting or willing to put the time into these champions, there are other easier options. These aren't like the pinnacle of the top lane, but they are very powerful picks to have within your arsenal. Yorick is a great low elo pick. He massively struggles Masters Plus. Like he has one of the most aggressive fall off cards of any top laner. Most people don't understand how to play against Maiden for like average and low elo. The higher up you go, people understand how to play against Maiden, understand how to play against your ghouls, understand like the functionality of the champion, and he really suffers from that. Teemo, well, yeah, I'll grab Teemo first. Teemo sits towards the high end of the A tier. He's also a very good scaling low elo pick. Which is interesting because obviously he has lane bully aspects to him, which can make him quite oppressive, especially if like people don't understand how to play against it. But the shroom scaling, like the control over objectives, like especially if people don't clear your shrooms and don't play around the objectives correctly, he can be a really oppressive scaling option. Olaf sits within the A tier. This champion has could arguably be slightly lower in the A tier. I could honestly probably put him more like mid A tier. I don't think he's the top of A tier. He's really good in specific matchups where you can get a lot of value out of his ultimate, out of his ability to chase people down. You don't really want to blind him, but he's a great counter pick in the right spots. In the case of Aatrox, he could honestly be bumped up to the S tier. I think Aatrox is definitely one of the highest options in the A tier at the moment. This pick is in a really good spot and is kind of slept on. I say slept on, like he's not the most popular top laner in the game at the moment. But yeah, he does a huge amount of damage. He scales relatively well. There are a lot of lanes which can't really interact with him without obviously being traded into quite heavily. And overall, yeah, I'd say he's in a very solid spot at the moment. Case of Quinn, I managed to miss her. She is a very solid A tier option. Debuffs towards her, combined with Symbiotic Souls and some of the other changes, has enabled her to really find her footing within the top lane at the moment. Not one of the best top laners, but if you're very comfortable on Quinn, you should be able to find results at the moment. Moving on to the S tier then, we are going to lead off with, I'll lead off with the 2 champions which were adjusted in Singed and Gwen. Singed really benefited from his changes in low elo. It looks like he stayed relatively neutral in high elo. The main thing is, obviously it's easier to CS with your cube, which is better for your average player. In high elo though, most people could already consistently CS, especially if they're like proxying, but yeah, it's definitely a more low elo skewed nerf, low elo skewed buff rather, and yeah, he really benefited from it. It bumps him up to the S tier for the average player. If you're willing to put the games into him, he can be a very valuable option at the moment, to the point where I imagine he might get nerfed next patch. So that is definitely something to be aware of. In the case of Gwen, she is she was like monstrously OP at the beginning of the patch. She was the best thing you could play across like all ranks. They have since hotfix nerfed her. I don't think she is the best option anymore, but she is still very powerful. Whether she'll remain in the S tier or get dropped down to the high end of the A tier for average play, only time will tell. But for the moment, I think if you enjoy Gwen, you should really be playing her. She is in one of the best spots she's been in for a very long time. Some of the other picks within the S tier are going to be like your sets, who very one-dimensional playstyle, but still very oppressive early on into the game. If you ever get ahead on set, he can be a very valuable champion, and his W is a very powerful ability if used correctly. He wants to be a bit more like matchup dependent. It's like the same thing for Mordekaiser. Into specific matchups, they can be really valuable champions, especially in low elo. They don't scale as well into high MMR, especially Mordekaiser. He really struggles, but Set, yeah, can be like functional there because of just how strong his early game can be. Cho'Gath maintains a spot within the S tier. He's still probably the premier tank at the moment. The general changes he received were nice, and he didn't suffer as much from some of the tank itemization nerfs, as he kind of dabbled into some of the AP options anyway. So yeah, he still remains as like an S tier option, still very powerful in the right matchups. Garen drops down to the high end of the A tier. The direct nerfs he received this patch were noticeable. It was a nerf to his core itemization, losing damage on his E when you have on like your second, your third item is meaningful, and yeah, he definitely got a bit weaker from that. In the case of some of these other champions, we have Cassiopeia. She is a very solid champion in the right matchups where she can space kind of like a better Rise in the top lane. She just does a huge amount of damage and can scale incredibly well. I think this pick is really good if you can play her well. In the case of Kayle, she is one of the best scaling options in the game at the moment. Her early game isn't if you can get through the early game and you're playing into champions which can't really dive you or can't really like approach you without being like forcing to use a lot of their kit, she can be incredibly powerful. There are hard matchups for her, and she will struggle into the likes of Nasus, who is a lot more common in low MMR. But if you can like get the right matchups and you can pick her in the right games, she can be one of the best options to go to at the moment. In case of Warwick and Darius, they are probably my two highest S tier options at the moment. Darius has been really performing quite well for a while now. Obviously, the surge of jungle presence has really brought him like into the spotlight. It's more in jungle, like he's actually lost some player in top lane because obviously some of the Darius players went to the jungle. He got nerfed in the jungle, and that was meaningful. He lost like 3% win rate. He's now just a good jungler. Top lane Darius, however, is still a very good pick and still maintains his spot within the S tier. In case of Warwick, he's an incredibly good top laner at the moment, does a huge amount of damage. The one concern with the champion is that he falls off very aggressively, so you need to build early game advantages to really get a lot of value out of the pick. And then my S plus option, still the same, still the Urgot. I still think Urgot is the best champion to take you from gold, silver, plat, wherever you are, to master. If you just spam out a lot of the champion, you'll get very comfortable playing him. You stick to the core build of like the cleavers, the Shojuns, or the cleavers to Sterix, stuff like that. You should be able to, consistently climb, and I still recommend him as the premier option at the moment, as he's, very stable, scales really well, and just has a lot of things going for him in the current state of the game. Those are my thoughts. Bye guys for watching. I'll see you for the next one. Goodbye.